No more COVID. The Oriental Institute, no more. And grad students unionize. I am Jack Moore here with my co-host Arthur Long, and welcome to episode 2 of the Chicago Thinker podcast. How you doing, Arthur?
I'm doing great, Jack. Excited to start episode 2 of the podcast. Had a nice spring break. It's exciting to be back here on campus for spring quarter. Hopefully the weather turns around a little bit. We start getting some birds singing, some leaves growing on the trees. Because right now this weather's not too great.
Yeah, this weather has just been egregious this weekend, but luckily enough the Final Four is on, so we'll be able to watch something inside. But otherwise, things seem to be going pretty well, especially for you. This is something you've been a part of for a while, so why don't you give us a little insight on what's been going on?
Sure. Huge week this week, everybody. The University of Chicago stopped its COVID-19 testing, and Kenzie Bustamante wrote a wonderful article on this topic entitled "UChicago Stops COVID-19 Surveillance Testing." And she details the history of this Orwellian COVID system that we've had here at UChicago for the good part of 3 years. And just to give our viewers some brief color, in September of 2020, when students first returned to the University of Chicago, they mandated weekly testing for everybody and also mandated a 10 to 14 day quarantine upon arrival from out of state, even if you tested negative. And this affected me personally, being on the football team. I showed up ready to go compete and train with the rest of my team, and they wouldn't let me do that. They threw me off campus, and they said, you have to go sit for a week before you can even come and start working out. So that was the first taste of a really unfortunate journey through this draconian COVID system. And then in May of 2021, they mandated the vaccine. December of 2021, they mandated the booster. And with these mandates, they allowed you to get an exemption. I ultimately did receive a medical exemption. However, throughout the whole process, they would constantly wield these punishments of losing access to university buildings, not being able to register for class, to punish the people who would not comply with these restrictions. So this week, the university put out a statement, and they said, quote, "As part of our evolving response to COVID-19, the university is taking steps that reflect the growing integration of COVID-19 testing and care into regular healthcare services." So Jack, it's all over.
Yeah, I mean, it is all over. I mean, we both came in 2 years, or now 3 years ago, when the COVID-19 pandemic was in the thick of it. And unfortunately, I mean, I caught on the downside of those sorts of policies as well. My first 2 weeks here at the University of Chicago, I moved in. My parents had 3 hours to move me in. They had to leave. And I got locked in my dorm for 14 days on a hard lockdown. The farthest I could leave my room on this wonderful campus was to go to the bathroom across the hall and come back in. 14 days. And I mean, it affected other people as well. Even if you didn't have to quarantine for 14 days, like I unfortunately missed this, but a bunch of my friends got U-cared for a picture they posted online. They had their masks on and they were outside, and they got U-cared and got put on housing probation. And in the worst case, like they could have been thrown off of campus. Like, that's utterly unacceptable in any sort of situation. Like, they're taking necessary precautions. They take a picture for 5 seconds where they're all within 2 feet of each other. Like, you were just supposed to stop normal social interaction on campus at all costs. I mean, so many people got socially ostracized for, not masking or like taking the vaccine later on. And a lot of people just experienced social isolation, like literal physical social isolation like I did. And that happened to everyone in our grade. It happened to everyone in the grade after. And the funniest thing is that this mandatory testing, which is not the surveillance testing, no relation between that, but the mandatory testing that maintained until fall or winter of last year, like no one ultimately did it for like the last 6 weeks it was mandatory. So the university has just been really late on getting around to this. Like COVID ended effectively on campus right around the second week of fall quarter when people realized they weren't going to get hit hard for not going to testing. Like this has been a long time coming, and it's rightfully deserved. The university should have done this a long time ago.
Absolutely, it's certainly overdue. And the worst part about this, as Jack, you just touched on, is the university outlined these requirements and put these rules in place to empower all these miserable NPCs that would just punish people who would like to go outside and socialize and live their everyday life. So the U-Care system, which essentially was this COVID reporting system. We all had to sign this COVID attestation agreeing that we'd comply with all these ridiculous policies. And these miserable people would just go out of their way to photograph you, send it to the U-Care system, and you would get punished. I had one time where I was in the dining hall, I was filling up my water, I walked back to my table because I was sipping my water without my mask, and this crazy RH, N95, the whole deal, ran up to me, actually put his hands on one of my friends, and was shaking him, saying, "Put your mask on, put your mask on, put your mask on." And that's the thing, is the university really does not care about their students when they're putting these policies in place, because it disrupts. The reason why we come here is we love to learn. We want to take part in the intellectual life of the university, and we want to socialize as well. And defending that should be the university's #1 priority, and they failed. So I'm glad that this happened this week, the ending of surveillance testing, but it certainly was overdue, and there's a lot of guilt to go around, Jack, and I really don't think that any of these university administrators are going to admit and apologize.
Yeah, they're not going to, nothing will happen to them ultimately. I mean, there is no recourse for students who were hit by this in any significant capacity. But another note about U-Care, just for everyone who doesn't know about it, it's an anonymous reporting system.
That's very important.
So you have no idea who sent the picture or what even happened. I don't think they show really a whole lot of information onto why you have been reported and now why you're on probation. It's just simply you violated the rules thrown at you from the administration. So now you're basically you're on thin ice for, I don't know, a quarter, 2 quarters, something like that, as long as this testing was going on. So to have it released, it's just it's a weight off of a lot of people's backs in so many ways. And the surveillance testing was really just the last semblance and hanger-on of that sort of policy, because now it's effectively over. There's nothing left on campus.
Yeah, this is just the last gasp of this COVID regime.
Yeah, and COVID hasn't gone away. COVID is still here.
Right.
There's still a bunch of cases going around nationwide, but
there's a war in Ukraine. That's more important now.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, it's definitely been a big change in pace, and everyone should be very glad that this is now over. Yeah. So yeah, I believe.
It's I'm very happy, but long overdue, and people like Emily Landon at UChicago Med and the rest of these heartless university administrators, they're never going to pay the price for the damage they've caused, and some students really are damaged irreparably, unfortunately, and they really do have no recourse. So I'm certainly not going to forget it. We're not going to forget it here at the Chicago Thinker, but I hope everybody else remembers what occurred here the past 3 years, because it truly was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the good thing about this is that new students will not have to deal with what we went through. God willing, another pandemic doesn't happen, and all this goes to crap again. But I mean, it shouldn't drive people away from the academic mission that the university purports to have. We need people who are willing to come here, willing to spend time on campus, and willing to talk to people and try to grow in their academic understanding of things. But I mean, there's a real question as to how much that will continue at the university as well. The university does a great job, at least in its fundamentals, and we talked about this on the last podcast.
Yes.
Their fundamentals are very good about free speech in the academic rigor that we have, but that could ultimately be cheapened by new transitions that are happening within the college and just within the academia more broadly. And a potential example of this, although I have my own personal thoughts about it, is the changing of the Oriental Institute's name. For those who don't know, the Oriental Institute is a museum we have on campus right by the economics department. And Declan Hurley, our editor-in-chief, talked about this at length in one of his articles entitled "Historical Incineration Lives On, UChicago's Oriental Institute to Change Its Century-Old Name." And he goes through and he details the history of this museum and why it was named that way. And he talks a lot about why the name is changing. Now, he says, and this is directly from the university who tried to justify their decision, there are 2 parts to it. First, that Oriental does not mean what it did 100 and 130 years ago, right around when the museum was founded, and that's fair enough. I mean, Oriental clearly does not mean West Africa in the Middle East anymore. Most people think it refers to the Far East in Japan, China, those sorts of countries. But the second reason, and this is the one that is concerning, is that it was deemed that Oriental was offensive, so they needed to change the name. Now, that is some cause for concern because this is a historical museum. It may contain historical artifacts inside it, but the museum itself, it existed before the college even came onto it. The museum was not originally part of the university. It was taken in as a means to continue this academic rigor that we have at the university. Now, just for my own personal feelings about it, I feel like that first reason is at least justifiable in some sense because educating people is a difficult process in a lot of senses because a lot of people either they don't want to learn or they don't have the time to, or they're just going to the museum to visit the museum. And changing the name from Oriental to Near East Studies or something like that, I could understand that. But the second reason, which I think is the primary reason behind it, and I don't think we have to we don't have to avoid that. The obvious reason is that they think or they believe Oriental to be offensive. And I'm sure in some cases it might be, but I don't know if it's correct in any sort of sense to change a historical name, like the first name of it, with that sort of justification. Confusing people, we can have a debate about that. But in an attempt to change the narrative around the museum and effectively try to slander the university in some sense by saying they endorse this horrible, horrific name, that concerns me in no small part.
Absolutely, Jack. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Confusing, sure. Derogatory, no. And where I come down on it is, and this is a quote from the Institute's interim director who is responsible for making the push for this change, is he said, quote, "The word Oriental has developed a pejorative connotation in modern English," end quote. So this is the thing. We're the University of Chicago. We're a premier intellectual destination. This is a museum on our campus. And Declan wrote very eloquently about this in his piece, is we have an inherent obligation here to educate, to find out what the truth is, and then defend it. And if something is confusing, and it honestly will hurt the education of people because they don't know what it means, that's fine. But it's important for people to know what the word Oriental means and how it was used in history, not run away from it and just say, oh, it's derogatory, it's offensive, and run away. And historically, it meant the Middle East, the Near East, and then it developed to mean the Far East, China, Japan. And I think what universities should be doing is not running away from these issues. They can be thorny, but actually say, okay, it may be confusing, but this is what it means. And I just think this is another step in the direction of academia to kind of erase history and kind of stay secluded up in their ivory tower instead of going out and teaching the world and their students and their visitors the facts about history and about words.
Yeah, I mean, it's just very difficult because where I'm from, the word Oriental is so sparsely used that there are a lot of people that just don't know what the word means entirely. They're going this is not a word that you would use in common English in a lot of senses. I mean, some people might, but when referring to the Middle East, people say the Middle East, or they say West Africa, or they say Egypt in specifically, which is one of the Oriental Institute's primary focuses.
Yes.
But I mean, it just seems odd to do it at this point in time. I don't know how many people were truly up in arms about the name the Oriental Institute, especially because it predates basically any movement to go about it. It's not like the university came and named it this, which would entirely I mean, if there was a case to be made, sure, fine, we can argue about that. But this thing is back in 1896 when it was founded.
Right.
There is some historical significance to the name it has. And for those people who are going to the Institute, which I assume is going to be people who are more well-read, they should have some understanding that the name is not meant in any way to be derogatory or anything like that.
Exactly.
I mean, it's quite scary that they they would do something like this just out of the blue.
Bingo.
I mean, of course, that depends on what the name is going to be changed to, because I don't know, maybe they hit the nail on the head with the naming. I doubt they could do better than what the original name was, but I mean, it's still yet to be done. And I believe April 4th is when the new name is supposed to come out, or at least something, like the commission is supposed to reveal something about that. So, not to cast judgment entirely yet, but it does concern me about the movements they are being making, not just in the Oriental Institute, but in academia generally, to take important names off of particular halls. Like Woodrow Wilson's name got taken off of a hall. John C. Calhoun, a much more controversial figure, at least in today's times, definitely has been taken off the halls in South Carolina. Like that is somewhat concerning, because those are very important historical figures. And the Oriental Institute is actually like a smaller part of that, because a lot of people don't know about it. But that doesn't make it any less important in academia, especially at the University of Chicago.
Absolutely, and that's what, it's a very slippery slope. And as if it was purely just, as I said earlier, changing the name because of confusion, that's fine. But the Hyde Park Herald, our local newspaper here in Hyde Park, Chicago, wrote that the Oriental Institute joins a succession of other international museums and research institutions rebranding to address their derogatory origins. And what you were just talking about, that is the part that is a cause for concern. Rebranding to address their derogatory origins. Because ultimately, what it comes down to is, who is the arbiter of what is derogatory and not? And when we're just calling things derogatory left, right, and center, there inevitably are going to be things that certainly are not derogatory, and now we're erasing them from history. Like you mentioned at Princeton and with Calhoun. So I certainly disagree with it, and hopefully the name isn't too far off the deep end, and will just be simply more accurate.
And before we move on to the next topic of discussion, I think that last quote from the Herald was very important when they're talking about addressing their derogatory origins. I mean, the word Oriental, at least in that time period, really before like the 19th century, it essentially just meant not European.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think in any way it was supposed to be particularly derogatory. I think it was just meant to say, this is an area of the world we are studying, and that is what the Orient is. Like at that point, like connections with the Far East are going to be a lot less than what they are now. Like traversing the Pacific or going across the entirety of continental Asia is a much more difficult task than going to what is now Israel, in Iran, in Iraq, and in Egypt. Like that's a far different part of the world, and I think that the Oriental Institute's like primary focus is to like go and find the history of Egypt in the Middle East and link it back to what is essentially the university and Western culture. Like it's not meant to be derogatory. It's meant to like actually put it on a pedestal and say this is important, this is the history, and this is how it influences us today. Now, I think that kind of undermines the case, at least in the first part, of saying that like people don't understand it.
Right.
Because going back to the origins is not the same as people don't understand what the word Oriental means. But yeah, and it's not a very strong case, is what it sounds like.
It's a weak case, and like you said, the idea that they're rebranding to address their derogatory origins, it's not just the name. This is a push from the left across institutions, government. This is how they think of America now. It's inherently racist or derogatory or evil. So this is right out of the 2023 leftist playbook, and it's sad that it's here at U Chicago, which should be the bastion of defending against this kind of woke push. So speaking of pushes, we had an election here at U Chicago this past last week, and we had two pieces about it. The first was by Kenzie Bustamante again. Kenzie's getting a lot of time this week. She's a great writer. She wrote an article entitled "U Chicago Stands Down in Face of Graduate Student Unionization," and then David Nielsen wrote a piece entitled "U Chicago Graduate Students Vote to Unionize." So David essentially wrote about just kind of the background, and what occurred was essentially the National Labor Relations Board conducted an election here with all the graduate students who are eligible to vote, and 1,696 of them voted in favor for unionizing, and 155 voted against it. And this was announced on Thursday, March 16th. So a couple weeks ago, excuse me. And so David detailed the election, and then Kenzie pointed out that this is a bit of an about-face from the university, because back in 2017, there was an informal vote to unionize the graduate schools, and it was not run by the NLRB. And the university refused to recognize these results. The graduate student union website says they were hoping for a conservative NLRB to overturn the legal ruling that allowed grad students to unionize. And even recently, right before this election, the provost sent out an email saying that the university's position is that unionization is not in the best interest of graduate students. So it's a little bit of a flip-flopping on the university, and I'm not quite sure why they are unionizing, Jack.
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, I've talked to some people who are graduate students, and we have some on the Thinker, but it's, I mean, if they want to unionize, they want to unionize, and it seems like the introduction of the NLRB into the equation is the reason why this is now being considered legitimate by the university. I don't know why the university has become so friendly with the union, especially when the union is going to be collectively bargaining against the university. Right. But what they're collectively bargaining for, like, I mean, I guess generally they're following what other unions are supposed to do, but I don't know if they're going to get that. I've talked with people that are currently in the union, because it represents essentially all research graduate students here. They don't really know what they're going to get. I've heard that they might like get expanded like insurance for things like dental, but like it's not as if it's going to make a massive change. I think this is more just a unionization in preparation for in case anything like goes on to which they can gain power. Like I don't know how strong their backing is or what sort of leverage they truly have over the university, except that they're just going to strike, and the university could probably rectify that fairly quickly by getting other undergraduates, given how prestigious the institution is. Like, I mean, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me what they're going for. I mean, like, I understand why they would unionize. The vast majority of the graduates are probably to the left of what you would think, and they're obviously more pro-union, so it makes sense they would unionize in general. I just don't know what's going to come out of it. And maybe we just don't know and things haven't happened yet, because the vote obviously happened very recently and collective bargaining agreements are starting. But I wouldn't expect much to change from the unionization. Maybe I'm wrong about that. We just don't know. But from what I've heard from the people who are in the union, it doesn't seem like a whole lot's going down.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think much is going to come of it. Maybe they get a little bit more money through collective bargaining, but I doubt it's going to be a big shift. The bigger news for me in this is just the U Chicago administration kind of capitulating and not really taking a firm stance against unionization as they did earlier. And I mean, part of that is, President Zimmer was here in 2017 and he was firmly against it. And now we have President Alivisatos, and I think he's not as strong as President Zimmer, and I'm holding the line on this. So we'll see where it goes. But like you said, Jack, I don't think that it's really going to change a whole lot.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of it for the Chicago Thinker news. But I mean, the next thing we're going to talk about really ties in with the administration point, because who you have in administrative positions is so important to how things are going to be run and how political parlance is going to be held. Indeed. In particular places. And at law schools across the country, like the University of Chicago Law School is at the top, and it's very good at maintaining its place as a place of free speech, and at least some capacity, of course, like overwhelmingly more left center going to law school, but they do a very good job at least trying to have multiple representations and maintaining power within the administration of the law school.
Yes.
But other places aren't necessarily doing that. I mean, at this point, one of the biggest stories that's come out with regards to law schools is the Stanford Law School debacle, that happened with Judge Stuart Kyle Duncan, circuit judge, I believe, for the Sixth Circuit.
Fifth, I believe.
Fifth Circuit, okay.
Yeah.
But he went to law school. He went to the Stanford Law School in order to give a speech, and they basically heckled him down, and he didn't get any defense by the dean of the law school. Like, it is baffling to me that would be the case. I mean, maybe it's different because we came to the University of Chicago and we were able to like have this culture, at least this setup of being able to listen to very important judges. Like the Fifth Circuit is no joke. Like that's making law for a large section of the country, if not all of it. And I mean, something else happened. This is now after the Stanford debacle. Columbia University Law School had Brett Kavanaugh, a sitting Supreme Court justice, visiting their Federalist Society. And many of the student groups on campus are trying to get Columbia to basically back off of saying he came to our university. And I would not be surprised if they want an apology. I mean, you've had several groups, including the Black Law Students Association, who are effectively trying to pressure Columbia into not having him back or not having anyone like him on. I mean, that same association said that they're not going to help Columbia recruit black applicants. And in the end, like, first of all, that seems kind of counterproductive. I mean, like, if you want black students to succeed, like, Columbia is a great place to go. I have a very good law school. But it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense that you wouldn't have a sitting Supreme Court justice there to at least try to learn something. Like, people misunderstand Supreme Court justices. There's always a reasoning to what they do, and most people don't read that reasoning. I mean, the discussion about, I mean, just the most obvious case is Dobbs v. Jackson. Like, that did not ban abortion in any significant sense, and it never will. It actually makes it more difficult to ban abortion nationally than it ever has been before. But that's not the message you're going to hear from a lot of these places. No. I mean, it's happening everywhere. Having Stanford, having a Columbia. If you will remember, I believe it's almost a year back now, Yale has had several of its law clerks just not, like, they're not going to be interviewed by a lot of the circuit judges just because they think that Yale Law School is just, they've lost their minds, and they're not upholding their own academic standards. So, I mean, maybe it's good for the University of Chicago Law School, and maybe it's good for places like Notre Dame and George Mason and whatnot, but like for the entirety of the country, the most prestigious institutions are losing their ability to really hold to any semblance of free speech in academic inquiry with respect to at least law.
Yeah, it's very upsetting, and like you said, Jack, these are the top law schools in the country. Stanford, Columbia, Yale. We are at U Chicago, which we said is good. They have a great Federalist Society here, and U Chicago Law School does well. But all these other law schools, the students pushing all of this BS and not allowing conservative voices, originalist voices to be heard. All of these students are going to be the top lawyers in the country in 5, 10, 15 years. They're going to have all the top spots at all the big law firms. These are future judges and prosecutors. And I really feel that the idea of what law is really getting flushed down the toilet. And like you said, Yale has gone so far off the deep end, some circuit judges just aren't hiring law clerks. Judge Ho on the Fifth Circuit, who's great, U Chicago Law School alumnus, he was the first one who said, I'm not going to hire clerks from Yale Law School because the mission of law school has been fundamentally changed and it's wrong. And just to talk about the Judge Duncan incident at Stanford Law School a little bit more, these protests against Judge Duncan were started by the student coalition named Identity and Rights Affirmers for Trans Equality, acronym IRATE, after this request for him to have the speech canceled was denied. And just to get an idea, folks, of who these people are and who these future lawyers and leaders and judges and prosecutors are, these are the same kinds of people who held a trans day of vengeance less than a week after a transgender person shot up a Christian school. These are the same people who memorialized 7 people who died in this Tennessee school shooting, not 6. 6 people were killed. The 7th who they're memorializing was the shooter. So these are the same kinds of people who are going to be running the country and running the justice system in 5, 10, 15 years. And you all say justice is blind. We know with the politicization of the DOJ that is not true anymore. So people really need to pay attention to what's happening. A lot of times, news at law schools isn't really publicized. Law school in the legal community is kind of niche, but this is dangerous for our country and the rule of law here, Jack.
Yeah, there's so much wrong with the situation, just on a nationwide scale. And, God bless us that we go to the University of Chicago, and the closest law school we have, top 3 in the country, more than likely top 10 in the world. Fantastic law school, and they have a commitment to actual academic inquiry and free speech and whatnot. But I just want to point out, because the op-ed that was published by Judge Duncan in the Wall Street Journal really kind of shows sort of the absurdity of all of this. And that's really on 2 counts. First, that the case he was writing on, the case that they're really, really against, was a federal prisoner, after serving a term for attempted receipt of child pornography, who also had a previous state conviction for possession of child pornography, petitioned the court in order to basically be called feminine pronouns. And Duncan basically said, we don't have the ability to do anything about that. It's not our problem. And effectively, what was being called on was that they denied a trans person existence. But the judge, people misunderstand judges so much. Judges are not lawmakers, and they cannot change really anything unless they want to rock the boat and essentially go outside of their jurisdiction, which is something that we're against, at least on this podcast, and I think most people should be against.
Right.
So that's really just an absurdity. And the second one is that not only was, I'm going to butcher her name, Tyrene Steinbeck, she was the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that allowed this to go on, and eventually basically just defended the people who were heckling Judge Duncan and allowed them to essentially ask Duncan for an apology and not the other way around, which is baffling in my mind, that you would heckle someone and then ask them for an apology when you were the one ruining his speech and ultimately ruining the learning of other people on campus. Yeah. And it wasn't just her, apparently, it was other administrators as well. So that's why the administration point matters so much. As long as if these universities are hiring administrators who are just going to openly push an agenda, or at least not going to defend people who have an alternative viewpoint to them, that ultimately is just going to cheapen law school. And it's going to be great for all of the other universities to actually have a somewhat conservative, even if they're if there is such thing as a conservative law school out there, it's just going to have them shoot up through the rankings. They're going to have all the best kids going there just so they're able to go and express their own viewpoints and try to learn more about the law in any significant context.
Yeah. And just the last word is, I know all of us here at the Chicago Thinker, if Justice Sotomayor or Justice Kagan, who in terms of understanding of the law we disagree with, but if they were coming to speak at Chicago Law School, we would jump at that opportunity. It would be great to hear from a sitting justice or federal judge, regardless of political affiliation. Even though judges are not supposed to be political, certainly you can see the way that they approach the law. And it seems that it's really only one side really wants that free and open debate and discourse. And these are the same people that are saying discussion is for fascists. We can't even discuss things anymore because we're a fascist. So it's really upsetting, but it's very important for everybody to pay attention to what's going on at these law schools, because it will affect your day-to-day life, because these people will be in positions of power one day. So I think that wraps it up for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Chicago Thinker podcast, and don't forget to outthink the mob. Thank you.